Hillary Clinton's legacy of failure was about to be laid bare for the entire world to see. Picture this. The air in the White House press briefing room was thick with anticipation. The cameras rolled, the overhead lights flared, and the official podium gleamed under the harsh glare. Journalists from CNN, MSNBC, and the New York Times sat rigid, their pens poised, waiting for the inevitable clash. Pete Hegseth stepped up to the microphone, his expression controlled, his presence commanding. He adjusted his stance, glanced briefly at the notes before him, and then delivered the opening strike without hesitation. Hillary Clinton just got nuked into the sun. The murmurs started almost instantly. A few reporters exchanged uneasy glances. Others hesitated, waiting to see if this was an exaggeration or if Hegseth truly intended to go for the jugular. "You want to talk about Russia?" he continued, letting the question linger just long enough to unnerve the room. "Then let's talk about who actually made Russia stronger, Hillary Clinton." The tension in the room thickened, a silent understanding settling among the press corps. They knew where this was going. Behind Hegseth, a massive screen flickered to life. He didn't wait for a rebuttal. Instead, he turned slightly and gestured toward the display. "Since everyone here is so keen on accountability, let's revisit a moment of actual consequence." The video played. The room watched as Hillary Clinton, during a congressional hearing on Benghazi, waved a dismissive hand and uttered the words that would forever stain her political career. What difference at this point does it make? The clip ended, but the silence did not. Hegseth let it hang for a moment before speaking, his voice dropping just enough to force everyone to listen. 4 Americans died, and when asked why, that was her response. He folded his hands on the podium, giving the journalists a moment to process. "You cover politics, so let me ask you, would any of you be writing this off if a Republican had said it?" A few reporters shifted in their seats. A CNN correspondent raised a hand slightly but thought better of it. "The American people remember. That's why what difference does it make, is already trending." He gestured toward his phone. "The public has spoken, and so far they seem far more interested in holding Hillary Clinton accountable than you do." The journalists remained silent, some furiously typing on their laptops. Hegseth nodded slightly. "Let's continue." The screen behind him flickered again. A new video began playing. This, Hegseth said, was one of Secretary Clinton's first major acts as America's top diplomat. On screen, Hillary Clinton entered a room, a large red button in her hands, beaming as she greeted Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov. "We worked hard to get the right Russian word. Do you think we got it?" The video played out in real time. Lavrov studied the button for a moment before shaking his head. "You got it wrong. It should be Peregruska, but this says overcharged." Hillary's face froze for a split second. Then she forced a laugh, nodding in awkward acceptance. The screen froze on that frame. Her tight smile, Lavrov's unimpressed expression, the mistranslated button sitting between them. Hegseth turned back to the room. "This wasn't a joke. This was a high-level diplomatic meeting." He placed both hands on the podium. A bright red button, given to Russia by the Secretary of State during one of the most sensitive periods of nuclear tension in half a century. A few reporters whispered to each other. Others sat rigid, taking notes but avoiding eye contact. "If Trump had done this, we all know what would have happened," Hegseth continued. "Wall-to-wall coverage, international embarrassment. Trump weak on Russia." He scanned the press corps. But because it was Hillary Clinton, the story vanished. No response. The question is, why? The silence was telling. Hegseth let it linger a beat before exhaling sharply. "Let's move on." The energy in the room had shifted. Even the more aggressive reporters seemed hesitant to interrupt now. Hegseth tapped the podium. "Let's talk about something more tangible, something with receipts." Behind him, the screen lit up again, this time with financial records, timelines, and transaction flows. Who really helped Russia expand its nuclear capabilities? His voice was steady. Who greenlit a deal that allowed Russia to control a significant portion of America's uranium supply? The answer was already on the screen. Uranium One. "Bill Clinton signed the deal," Hegseth said matter-of-factly. "Hillary Clinton's State Department approved it. And while that deal was under review, The Clinton Foundation received $145 million from interest directly tied to it. A few gasps. A handful of reporters exchanged glances. If Donald Trump had done this, Hegseth continued, you'd be calling it treason. And yet, here we are. He turned back toward the screen. A timeline appeared, showing millions of dollars flowing into the Clinton Foundation while the deal was in motion. This is not speculation. This is not conservative media spin. These are official financial records. He let that sink in before delivering the final blow. And why did Hillary do it? He paused. Because she was paid. This is Clinton foreign policy in its purest form, getting paid by foreign governments. Several journalists were furiously typing now, but no one interrupted. Hegseth glanced at his phone and allowed a smirk to break through. Uranium-1 is trending. Seems like the American people are paying attention. A deep breath. Let's continue. The room was no longer a press briefing, it was a courtroom, and Pete Hegseth was the prosecution. The evidence had been laid out, clear, damning, impossible to ignore. Yet the journalists before him, the so-called watchdogs of democracy, sat frozen, their silence louder than any objection they could muster. The weight of his last statement still lingered, the accusations of corruption and pay-for-play diplomacy burning into the air like a brand. He let them sit with it for a beat longer before moving in for the next strike. You want to talk about national security failures? He paced slightly, his hand tapping the edge of the podium. Let's move past finances. Let's move past the backdoor deals. Let's talk about something you can't put a price on. American lives. The screen behind him flickered again, this time to a darker scene. A burning U.S. consulate, smoke billowing against the night sky, chaos in the streets of Benghazi, Libya. The timestamp in the corner read September 11th, 2012. No one in that room needed an introduction to this footage. They'd seen it before, reported on it, spun it, but now there was no editorial filter, no convenient narrative to reshape the truth. Hillary Clinton wants you to forget about this, where Hegseth continued, his voice devoid of theatrics. He didn't need dramatics. The raw reality played behind him. She wants you to believe it was just another unfortunate event, an unavoidable tragedy. But let's be clear, this didn't have to happen. A clip rolled, Clinton testifying before Congress, her expression stony, her tone clipped. Was it because of a protest, or was it because of guys out for a walk one night who decided they'd go kill some Americans? Hegseth exhaled sharply through his nose. That's how she framed it, like some random act of violence, a tragic coincidence. Like the lives lost here weren't a direct result of her failure. The footage shifted again, this time showing an earlier report. Security requests sent from the consulate to Clinton's State Department months before the attack, warning of the growing threat, pleading for reinforcements. These men saw it coming. They begged for help. And what did Clinton's State Department do? He glanced at the room, daring someone to answer. No one did. The screen now displayed a printed denial, security request rejected. And then, when the attack came, when they were surrounded, fighting for their lives, what did she do? His voice was steady, but beneath it, restrained fury. Nothing. She let them die. A different video played now, Clinton again, but this time, her most infamous words from that hearing. What difference at this point does it make? Silence. Hegseth leaned in slightly, his tone measured, precise. It makes every difference. A pause, a shift in energy. This wasn't just about exposing corruption anymore. It was about something deeper, accountability, truth, the price of failed leadership. The journalists before him sat in various states of discomfort, some stone-faced, others writing furiously, perhaps crafting their rebuttals in real time. A few, he could tell, weren't sure what to do with what they were hearing. Because how do you spin this? The difference, Hegseth pressed on, is that 4 Americans didn't come home. The difference is that their families were given excuses instead of answers. And the difference is that the person responsible never paid the price. He straightened, scanning the faces before him. If this had been any other administration, if this had been a Republican president's Secretary of State, tell me, would you be sitting here in silence? He let the question breathe. Or would this be all-consuming? Would this be a scandal of historic proportions? Another pause, another round of silent, unspoken answers. The American people aren't stupid, he continued, voice calm but unrelenting. They know a cover-up when they see one, and that's exactly what this was. A shift on the screen, the reports following Benghazi, the administration's initial insistence that the attack was sparked by an internet video rather than a premeditated act of terror. More headlines, more contradictions. That lie was intentional, Hegseth stated plainly. They knew the truth, but the truth was inconvenient, and so they spun a story. They deflected. They buried the facts under a mountain of political damage control. A CNN reporter cleared their throat slightly, as if preparing to interject, but thought better of it. This press corps, Hegseth continued, had the power to demand answers. You had the ability to push for real justice. Instead, you carried water for her. You downplayed it. You let the story die. A hard pause, but the internet never forgets. He gestured toward his phone, unlocking the screen and holding it up. Right now, #HillaryExposed is trending. Millions of Americans are seeing this footage again, some for the first time. The truth is spreading, and it's spreading fast. A reporter from the New York Times finally spoke up. Mr. Secretary, aren't you politicizing a tragedy? Hegseth turned his gaze on the man, unwavering. You tell me. When CNN ran wall-to-wall coverage of supposed war crimes in the Trump administration, was that politicizing a tragedy? His tone didn't change, but the impact was clear. The reporter had no response. If demanding justice for American lives lost due to gross negligence is politicizing a tragedy, then fine, he said. I'll wear that label proudly, because this isn't just about the past. It's about who holds power, who gets to write history, and who gets away with failure. The room felt heavier now, as if the realization had settled that this wasn't just a one-off event, that everything about Clinton's career, the scandals, the deflections, the evasions, was part of a larger, carefully constructed narrative, one that was now being shattered in real time. Hegseth turned slightly, scanning the faces before him once more. Let's continue, he said, signaling for the next footage to roll. The story wasn't over. Not yet. The tension in the press room had shifted from discomfort to something closer to desperation. The journalists who had entered this briefing with smug certainty now sat in uneasy silence, their once sharp pens momentarily dulled. The weight of the previous segment still hung in the air. Benghazi laid bare, the failure undeniable, the words, "What difference does it make?" ringing in their ears. But Pete Hegseth wasn't done. You see, it's never just one lie, he said, his voice measured but deliberate. One deception always leads to another. One cover-up demands another layer of misdirection. And if you think the Benghazi scandal was an isolated case, you're not paying attention. The screen behind him flickered again, cutting to a familiar image. Hillary Clinton, mid-sentence, standing before a row of reporters. The timestamp in the lower corner read 2016 during her campaign. The volume kicked in, Clinton's voice firm but calculated. Donald Trump is dangerously aligned with Vladimir Putin. We cannot have a president who cozies up to Russia. Hegseth let the clip run for a few seconds longer before pausing it. And that was the moment, he said, looking at the press, that your networks, the people in this room, ran with the Trump-Russia collusion narrative like it was gospel truth. He stepped back, allowing the weight of his words to settle. For years, you told the American people that Donald Trump was compromised, that he was working for Putin, that he was a Russian asset. His voice remained steady, but the undercurrent of restrained anger was unmistakable. And now that it's been completely debunked, where's the accountability? Silence. Let me be very clear, he continued, his tone tightening. The entire Trump-Russia collusion story, the one your networks devoted hundreds of hours to, was built on fabricated intelligence. The screen flashed again, FBI documents, declassified reports. Let's go step by step, Hegseth said, so there's no room for spin. The next clip played, a montage of CNN, MSNBC, The Washington Post, The New York Times, all breathlessly reporting on Trump's supposed ties to Russia. Headlines blared across the screen. Trump-Putin connection raises questions about national security. Trump campaign allegedly coordinated with Russian intelligence. Sources: Trump knew about Russian hacking. The footage cut to Hillary Clinton once more, standing behind a podium. The evidence is overwhelming. Donald Trump must be investigated for his ties to Moscow. Hegseth turned back to the room. And what was the foundation of this story? The so-called Steele dossier, the document that drove FBI investigations, media hysteria, and the most aggressive political attack on a sitting president in modern history. A new image appeared, a page from the dossier itself, heavily redacted, but still visible enough to display its unverifiable claims. A dossier, Hegseth continued, that was bought and paid for by the Clinton campaign. A ripple of motion spread through the press pool. Some journalists shifted in their seats. Others furiously typed notes, likely formulating their damage control narratives in real time. And let's not forget, he added, that this wasn't just some misguided political maneuver. It was a deliberate effort to undermine an elected president, to manipulate public perception, and to weaponize government agencies against a political opponent. Another shift on the screen. Declassified memos from the FBI, notes from former intelligence officials admitting they had no evidence of Trump-Russia collusion, but pursued the investigation anyway. Here's the question, Hegseth said, his voice dropping slightly, forcing the room to lean in. If the Trump-Russia collusion hoax had been exactly reversed, if a Republican campaign had funded a fraudulent dossier to falsely tie a Democrat to a foreign adversary, what would the reaction have been? No one spoke. Hegseth nodded, as if expecting their silence. You don't have to answer, because we all know the truth. He glanced at his phone. Hillary Exposed was still trending. Russia hoax had joined it. The American people weren't just watching, they were reacting. You claim to stand for democracy, for transparency, for truth, Hegseth said, his tone now sharper. But the truth is, you helped manufacture a conspiracy theory that consumed this country for years. And now that it's fallen apart, you act like it never happened. New York Times reporter finally spoke up. But Mr. Secretary, weren't multiple investigations launched into Trump's Russia ties? Hegseth turned toward him, expression unwavering. And what did they find? The reporter hesitated. Nothing, Hegseth answered for him. Nothing except that the very origins of this hoax led straight back to Clinton's campaign and her allies in the intelligence community. The reporter cleared his throat but said nothing else. Hegseth let the pause stretch, knowing full well that the tension was exactly where it needed to be. This is not just about Trump. It's about the dangerous precedent you all set. The idea that false allegations, planted stories, and weaponized intelligence agencies could be used to cripple an elected administration. He let out a slow breath, tapping a finger against the podium. But here's the thing about the truth. It always catches up, and the people are catching up fast. Another glance at his phone. Trump was right was beginning to surface. This is what real misinformation looks like, he said, motioning toward the still frame of Clinton's speech. Not an offhand comment, not a social media post you don't like, but a full-scale orchestrated deception. And the fact that none of you in this room have the courage to admit it? He shook his head. That's the real scandal. A deep inhale. The next clip was ready. But let's continue. The unraveling wasn't just happening in real time. It was being broadcast to millions. The press pool sat rigid, some gripping their pens tighter, others typing furiously, likely crafting preemptive damage control. But Pete Hegseth wasn't about to let them regain their footing. You see, it's not just about the lies you tell, it's about the stories you refuse to tell. His voice was steady, but the weight behind it was crushing. It's about what you choose to bury. The screen behind him lit up once more, revealing an internal email, one that had never made it to the front pages of the New York Times or the Washington Post. Suppress the story. It could damage the candidate. A ripple of discomfort spread through the room. A few journalists froze mid-sentence. Others darted glances at one another, realizing that they were no longer in control of the narrative. Big tech, Hegseth continued, acted as the gatekeeper of information leading up to the 2020 election. And your outlets? You let it happen. You cheered it on. A new email appeared, this time between tech executives and political operatives. You weren't reporting, Hegseth said. You were coordinating. You helped silence stories that didn't fit the agenda, stories that would have changed how people voted, and you called it content moderation. A Washington Post journalist shifted uncomfortably. Social media platforms have rule, he tried. They were protecting the public from misinformation. Hegseth turned slightly, his expression unreadable. Another click. A new document flashed onto the screen. An email admitting a story was removed, not because it was false, but because it was potentially damaging. So let's be clear, Hegseth said, locking eyes with the journalist. The standard wasn't truth. It was political protection. No response. The American people see what you did. And no matter how much you suppress the truth, you can't stop what's happening right now. His phone buzzed. Hillary exposed. Censorship gate. Media complicit. The message was spreading. And we're just getting started. The room was no longer just tense. It was hostile. Not in open defiance, but in the quiet, seething discomfort of a press corps that had lost control of the conversation. Pete Hegseth could see it on their faces. The calculated restraint. The way some of them kept their hands off their keyboards as if refusing to document their own humiliation. But silence was as good as admission, and Hegseth wasn't going to let them off the hook. He leaned slightly against the podium, his voice calm but cutting. You ever notice how corruption only seems to matter when it's convenient? The screen behind him flickered, revealing a photo, one that should have been on every front page, but instead had been buried in the depths of internet archives. Hillary Clinton, grinning, shaking hands with a Russian oligarch. You all spent years screaming about Russian influence, about foreign interference in American politics. His tone was deliberate, the words weighted with accusation. And yet, when it comes to this, he gestured to the image behind him. Nothing, no outrage, no investigations, no weeks of breaking news coverage. A few reporters exchanged uneasy glances, some shifting in their seats, others suddenly taking interest in their notes. Let's talk about that, Hegseth said. A new document appeared on the screen. This time, it was financial records. Money flowing directly into the Clinton Foundation from foreign entities. The Clinton Foundation, he continued, wasn't just some charitable organization. It was a power machine, a pay-to-play operation where influence could be bought and sold for the right price. A few murmurs rippled through the room. The unspoken panic was setting in. He clicked again. Another document appeared. Millions of dollars in donations, traced back to foreign governments. Let's be real, Hegseth said. If the Trump family had a foundation that took hundreds of millions from foreign donors while in office, you'd be demanding congressional hearings. Hell, you'd be calling for treason charges. No one argued. But because it's the Clintons, he let the silence stretch. You all looked the other way. His phone screen lit up. Number Clinton Foundation was trending. The truth was spreading faster than they could contain it. And that's why the American people don't trust you anymore. The silence in the room had evolved. It was no longer just discomfort, it was resignation. Pete Hegseth had spent the past hour dismantling the narratives that the press had worked tirelessly to construct. The journalists before him weren't just avoiding his gaze now. They were questioning their next move. They had two choices: fight back and risk exposure, or stay silent and let the moment consume them. Hegseth didn't give them time to decide. Let's get to the heart of it, he said, his voice level, his tone sharper than before. Why isn't Hillary Clinton being held accountable? The question landed like a hammer. The screen behind him shifted once again, this time displaying a timeline of investigations. Every scandal, every congressional hearing, every criminal referral that had somehow ended in nothing. This is the pattern, he continued, stepping away from the podium. She gets caught, there's outrage, a hearing is held, a report is released, and then nothing. He gestured to the screen. Every single time, the cycle repeats itself. A few reporters looked up, hesitating. Was this where they would finally push back? Compare this to Trump, Hegseth continued. Multiple indictments, ongoing investigations, media hysteria, and yet somehow the woman at the center of more scandals than any politician in modern history walks free. His phone vibrated, another surge in online engagement. Two-tier justice system, Clinton impunity. Hegseth turned back to the journalists. So tell me, what makes her untouchable? A long pause. A CNN reporter finally spoke, her voice forced and measured. There's no evidence that Hillary Clinton has committed any crimes. Hegseth almost laughed. Almost. Another click. The screen changed. An FBI memo, a criminal referral, testimony from intelligence officials stating that laws had been broken. He glanced back at the reporter. Try again. Her mouth opened, then closed. You don't have to answer, Hegseth said, shaking his head, because everyone watching already knows. He let the weight of the moment settle before delivering the final strike. The truth isn't just being buried anymore, he said. It's being erased, and you're the ones holding the shovel. His words hung in the air like a final verdict. No one dared to object, and that silence said everything. The weight of the silence was suffocating. The press room, once a battlefield of narratives, had become a graveyard of credibility. Pete Hegseth had left no stone unturned, from Benghazi to the Clinton Foundation, from media complicity to big tech suppression, from the Russia hoax to the blatant double standard of justice. Every accusation had been backed by hard evidence, and every attempt to push back had been crushed before it could even begin. And yet, Hillary Clinton was still free. Hegseth straightened his posture, gripping the edges of the podium with measured force. The fight wasn't over. You want to know the most dangerous part of all this? His voice cut through the tension like a blade. It's not just that Hillary Clinton walks free. It's that she and the people protecting her still have power. A sharp click. The screen behind him flashed to life once again. This time, it wasn't emails. It wasn't old footage. It wasn't financial records. It was a live feed. The press shifted uncomfortably, their eyes darting toward the screen as they tried to make sense of what they were seeing. A closed-door meeting, high-ranking officials. Some of them were familiar faces. Clinton's longtime allies, political strategists, former intelligence officials. This was recorded just days ago, Hegseth said. Right now, while we sit in this room, Hillary Clinton's network is still working behind the scenes. The journalist stiffened. This was new. This wasn't just about the past. They don't just want power, he continued. They want to rewrite what you're allowed to believe. They want to control who gets investigated and who gets immunity. A murmur rippled through the press pool. The pressure in the room was shifting again, not just defensive, but anxious. A Washington Post reporter finally spoke, his voice tight with restraint. What exactly are you suggesting, Mr. Secretary? Hegseth turned to him, his expression unreadable. I'm not suggesting anything. He gestured toward the screen. I'm showing you the proof. A pause, then. She's not out of the game. He let that fact sink in. She's preparing for the next move. And if history has taught us anything, he scanned the room, locking eyes with the reporters who had spent years covering for her. It's that she won't stop until she's back where she wants to be. Another buzz on his phone. The internet was exploding. Hillary is still pulling the strings. He placed his hands firmly on the podium. So let's stop pretending she's just some retired politician, because the fight isn't over. The air in the press room was heavier now, not just with tension, but with something more profound. Realization. For too long, the people in this room had controlled the narrative, dictated what the public could and couldn't question. But now with every revelation, every undeniable fact laid bare, that grip had weakened, and Pete Hegseth could feel it. He looked across the room. The expressions before him ranged from blank to visibly unsettled. Some still scribbled in their notepads, not to report, but to calculate, to strategize how they would spin what had just transpired. Others avoided his gaze entirely, too aware that their silence had already answered the questions they refused to ask. But Hegseth wasn't here for them. He was here for the American people. He leaned in slightly, his voice measured, the final blow loaded and ready to land. So now the question is, What happens next? No one moved. For decades, Hillary Clinton has evaded justice, walked free, built a network so untouchable that not even the biggest political scandals could bring her down. He paused. And today we've exposed every piece of it. A sharp click. The screen behind him went dark. No more documents. No more emails. No more headlines. Here's what's different this time, he continued. This isn't just a press conference. This isn't just another political hit job. He exhaled, shaking his head slightly. This is the breaking point. A flicker of movement among the press. Some leaned forward slightly, sensing something coming, something bigger than all of them. The media can't hide it anymore. The tech companies can't suppress it anymore. The American people, they see it now. He held up his phone, the screen glowing with the latest surge of trending topics. Clinton Network. No more cover-ups. Hillary 2024? That last one made him chuckle, though there was no humor in it. Because that's the thing about power, he said, setting his phone down with a deliberate motion. People like her, they never really give it up. They just wait. A shift in the room, not denial, not defiance, something closer to fear. A New York Times journalist finally spoke, voice quieter than before. So you're saying this isn't over? Hegseth looked at him, then to the cameras, his message directed beyond the walls of this room. I'm saying, be ready. A beat of silence. Then with a final nod, he turned and walked off the stage. And the story, it was just beginning.